Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. So I have been accused at various points in my life of being one of those folks who thinks they're always right. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but in this particular case, I think I am. See, I wake up in the morning and I check the news, and lo and behold, I discover that there are some politicians that are discussing changing the boundaries of an election after the election process already started. Now, not because of a hurricane or because voting machines exploded or anything like that. No. Because the map might not produce the results they want. Now think about how insane that sounds if you strip away all the legal jargon and the cable news nonsense that usually gets poured all over stories like this. Imagine showing up to run a marathon, let's say, and around, mile 18, somebody says, hey, guess what? We actually don't like where the starting line was for this. We're moving it 3 blocks north, so everyone's got to start over. Now, that's the kind of thing that makes normal people look around and say, hold on, are we still pretending that this is stable, that this is normal? Because most Americans don't think about congressional district maps at all. I mean, most people are trying to just survive inflation and pay rent and keep their kids from eating deodorant sticks for TikTok challenges and, maybe get through a workday without developing a stress twitch. They're not sitting at Applebee's debating Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. District maps are invisible to most people, right up until those maps decide whose vote matters. And now, Alabama Republicans are exploring ways to potentially redo or restructure parts of the election process after that Supreme Court ruling opened new doors in the gerrymandering fight. And here's the thing, that this story is being reported like it's some obscure procedural political fight. Like this is just nerdy election law people moving folders around in a courthouse basement somewhere. Let me assure you, it is not. This is about whether politicians can increasingly manipulate democracy itself when democracy stops behaving the way they'd like it to. That's the real story. Because once voters start feeling like these rules can shift midstream depending on who's winning, public trust is gone. I mean, slowly at first, but then in a big hurry. And before we go any further, let me make something crystal clear. This episode is not me pretending that Democrats are saints sent down from the heavens riding, unicorns of campaign finance reform. Democrats absolutely gerrymander too. Illinois exists, Maryland exists. Everybody with power is tempted to protect that power. But Republicans, particularly at the national level and especially in the South, have spent years aggressively weakening the guardrails that once limited how far this stuff could go. They opposed major anti-gerrymandering reforms. They supported weakening the Voting Rights Act. Conservative legal groups pushed these cases through the courts for years. And now the Supreme Court they helped shape has handed them a political opening the size of an aircraft hangar. So when people act confused about why this is happening now, the answer really isn't mysterious. This was not an accident. This was a project. And the reason this matters so much is because gerrymandering is one of those political issues that sounds boring right up until you realize it quietly affects almost everything. Abortion laws, healthcare, education funding, labor protection, civil rights, environmental policy, all of it. Because before politicians pass laws, they first have to design the districts that elect the people who pass the laws. And that brings us to the ugly little engine sitting underneath this story, gerrymandering. Now, people hear that word and their eyes immediately glaze over like somebody just started explaining cryptocurrency at a barbecue. But the basic idea is actually pretty simple. Instead of voters choosing politicians, politicians design the voter pool they want. That's it. That's the game. And once you understand that, American politics starts making a lot more sense. Because when people imagine elections, they picture a neutral map. Fair boundaries, communities group together naturally. The best ideas win. Everybody goes home, and somewhere a bald eagle sheds a single patriotic tear. That's not how this works anymore. Modern gerrymandering is closer to political engineering. It's like electoral Photoshop. You zoom in block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, slicing communities apart with almost surgical precision until the math produces the desired outcome. And technology has supercharged this. This is not politicians hunched over paper maps in smoke-filled rooms anymore. This is advanced software analyzing voting history, demographics, turnout patterns, consumer behavior, census data, and partisan trends with terrifying accuracy. They can predict election behavior now like meteorologists track a hurricane. Only instead of asking, where will the storm hit? They're asking, how do we build districts where the storm can never hit us? Hello, neighbors, and happy Monday. And welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we are talking about, well, gerrymandering for the most part, but we're also going to talk about the lightning fast response that we're seeing in some places to the recent Supreme Court decision that basically just obliterated the main protections of the Voting Rights Act. So we'll go through this here in steps. Let's first talk about what gerrymandering actually is. There are two main tricks that make modern gerrymandering work: packing and cracking. Now, those sound like rejected titles from, a low-budget mob movie, but they're actually the foundation of the whole system. Packing means cramming as many opposing voters as possible into a small number of districts. So let's say you've got a heavily Democratic urban population. Instead of spreading those voters naturally across several districts, mapmakers shove them all into one or two overwhelmingly Democratic districts where Democrats win with, 70 or 80% of the vote. Which sounds great on paper until you realize that all those extra votes become politically useless outside of those districts. Congratulations. You won two districts by gigantic margins while losing 6 other districts by smaller ones. That's packing. And then there's cracking. Cracking is the opposite approach. Instead of concentrating voters, you split them apart like somebody's, taking a hammer to a dinner plate. You divide communities across multiple districts so their voting power gets diluted everywhere. And historically, this has often happened to black communities. That's where the racial dimension enters the story, and it's impossible to understand what's happening in Alabama right now without understanding that history. Because for decades, courts recognized something very important. You cannot pretend race and politics are neatly separable in large parts of the American South. You just can't. Voting patterns in many southern states are heavily polarized along racial lines. Black voters overwhelmingly support Democrats. White conservative voters overwhelmingly support Republicans. So when you start carving up districts in race-neutral ways, the outcome can still heavily weaken minority representation, even if nobody explicitly says the quiet part out loud. And for a long time, parts of the Voting Rights Act existed specifically to prevent that. Now, it didn't do it perfectly. It didn't do it consistently everywhere, but at least there were legal guardrails. The basic principle was you can't intentionally design maps that dilute minority voting strength. Now, before somebody listening starts yelling, "That's identity politics," let me explain why those protections existed in the first place. Because America has a very long history of finding creative ways to suppress minority political power without technically saying, hey, we're suppressing minority political power. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, at-large elections, strategically placed district boundaries. American discrimination has often operated like a magician. The trick only works if everybody agrees not to stare directly at his hands. And district maps became one of the cleanest tools for that. Because if you can divide communities strategically enough, you can reduce their influence while still technically holding elections. That's the dirty genius of gerrymandering. Nobody loses the right to vote. Their vote just loses any practical power. And this is where conservatives often make an argument that sounds reasonable at first glance. They'll say, well, district lines have to be drawn somehow. Very true. Or they'll say, both parties do it. Also true. But here's where the conversation usually stops before it reaches the important part. The question is not whether every map is political. Of course they are. The real question is, at what point does political map making become engineered representation? At what point are politicians no longer responding to voters, but designing electorates in advance to protect themselves from voters? Those are two very different things. One is democracy with politics inside it. The other is politics constructing democracy. And the reason modern gerrymandering is so dangerous is because it creates districts where elections stop being competitive. Think about that for just a moment. In a heavily gerrymandered district, the general election often barely matters anymore. The real contest becomes the primary, which means candidates are increasingly rewarded for appealing to the most ideologically intense voters rather than the broader public. That just pushes politics further outward toward the extremes, and that is the last thing we need these days. Moderation becomes risky, politically speaking. Compromise is seen as weakness, and outrage becomes a strategy. And then everybody acts shocked when Congress behaves like, a comment section. This is not accidental. the incentives are broken. And once politicians feel insulated from losing, accountability starts dying quietly in the background. That's why this matters so much more than just maps. This is about whether voters still meaningfully control the people representing them, or whether representation itself is being like reverse engineered from the top down. Now, to understand why Alabama Republicans suddenly seem so energized about redistricting again, we have to, of course, talk about the Supreme Court. And I know, the second people hear Supreme Court decision, their brains try to escape through their ears. But stick with me, because this part actually matters. Over the last couple decades, the Supreme Court has steadily weakened parts of the Voting Rights Act, especially the mechanisms used to challenge maps that diluted minority voting power. And the really important thing to understand is this: the court did not remove race from redistricting. That's not what happened. States can still consider race in certain circumstances. Courts can still recognize that racial discrimination in voting exists. Nobody in a black robe stood up and declared racism is over. Great work, everybody. That's the folks on Fox News. But what actually changed is more subtle and in some ways much more powerful. The court increasingly made it easier for states to say these districts weren't drawn because of race. They were drawn because of politics. And in places where race and party heavily overlap, that distinction becomes incredibly convenient. Because if black voters overwhelmingly vote Democratic and Republicans overwhelmingly benefit from weakening Democratic districts, then you can pursue outcomes that heavily affect racial representation while describing the entire thing as partisan strategy instead of racial discrimination. That's the legal escape hatch. And conservative legal thinkers have been building towards this argument for years. The basic idea goes something like this. Race-conscious districting itself can become unconstitutional if race becomes the dominant factor in the map making. Now, on paper, that sounds fair enough. Nobody wants districts shaped like, melted spaghetti solely because map makers are obsessing over race. But here's where the tension enters. For decades, the Voting Rights Act existed because pretending race didn't matter produced discriminatory outcomes. Now the court is increasingly skeptical of race-conscious remedies themselves. So states are left in this weird legal gray zone where they can say, we're not targeting race, we're just drawing politically advantageous maps. Even when everybody with a functioning frontal lobe understands there are racial consequences. And this matters enormously in Alabama, because Alabama has a long history of battles over black representation in its congressional districts. The state is roughly 27% black, but for years, only one of its 7 congressional districts reliably gave black voters the ability to elect their preferred candidate. 1 out of 7. Civil rights groups challenged that map under the Voting Rights Act, arguing black voters were being unfairly diluted through district design. And lower courts actually agreed. That's important. This wasn't some fringe internet argument. Federal courts looked at the evidence and essentially said, yeah, this map violates the Voting Rights Act. And for a while, it looked like Alabama would be required to maintain multiple districts where black voters had meaningful electoral influence. But then the broader legal climate started shifting. And once the Supreme Court signaled greater openness to limiting race-conscious districting protections, Republican officials in multiple southern states immediately saw an opportunity. That's the context for what is happening now. This didn't emerge from nowhere, like a raccoon coming out of a dumpster. This is the culmination of years of legal strategy. Years. And what frustrates a lot of critics is that defenders of these maps often talk as if race itself has vanished from political reality. Like everybody suddenly votes in a perfectly race-neutral vacuum. But that's nonsense. And history does not disappear because courts become uncomfortable thinking about it or just don't want to. The Voting Rights Act was not created because America had an overabundance of fairness. It was created because states repeatedly found ways to undermine minority voting power while technically preserving elections on paper. That's the history underneath all of this. And here's the part that really gets me. Conservatives spent years warning America that democracy was hanging by a thread because of voter fraud. We hear it all the time. They tell us elections are fragile and sacred and constantly under threat. And now some of those same political forces are aggressively manipulating district structures themselves to maximize power retention. That is a contradiction that matters. Because if democracy is sacred, then representation should matter too. You cannot scream about protecting elections while treating district maps like adjustable cheat codes every time demographics stop cooperating with your political goals. And before somebody says, well, Democrats would do the same thing. Yes, Democrats absolutely pursue political advantage too. But Republicans have been far more aggressive in the courts and legislatures about weakening the legal mechanisms that are meant to restrain this specific kind of power. And that distinction matters. Because once those restraints weaken, the temptation becomes obvious. If you can't reliably win over more voters, you redesign the map instead. And that brings us to the part of the story that sounds less like a normal democratic procedure and more like somebody trying to reload a saved game because they didn't like how the level was going. The possibility of reworking election timelines, potentially even redoing parts of the primary process itself. Now, to be clear, election schedules have changed before in American history. Courts have delayed primaries and states have adjusted timelines after census problems. Maps have been struck down as unconstitutional close to elections, and special elections have happened. So this is not exactly unprecedented alien event descending from the sky over Montgomery, but context matters. Intent matters, and timing matters. Because historically, many of those interventions happened after courts determined maps were unconstitutional or voting rights had been violated. The disruption was framed as an attempt to restore fairness or comply with a legal requirement. But what feels different here is the perception that politicians are exploring whether a newly favorable Supreme Court environment can be leveraged for partisan gain after the machinery of the election process has already started moving. And regular people instinctively understand why that feels dangerous. Because elections are supposed to feel stable. They're not supposed to be flexible. They're not supposed to be improv. They're not, we'll workshop the rules depending on the polling data. They're supposed to be stable. You are supposed to know what rules there are before the game begins. And once voters start believing those rules can be adjusted whenever one side gets nervous about losing power, what happens to trust? That's not a partisan statement. That's just human psychology. People can survive losing elections. What they struggle to survive are events that make them lose faith that the elections themselves are legitimate. And here's the thing that makes this especially combustible in Alabama. The state's racial and political history is not ancient history buried in some museum somewhere behind dusty glass. This is a state that sat at the center of some of the ugliest voting rights battles in modern American history. Selma happened in Alabama. Bloody Sunday happened in Alabama. Federal voting protections became absolutely necessary because states across the South repeatedly manipulated systems to suppress black political power. So when modern fights emerge over district lines and minority representation, people aren't reacting in a vacuum. There is historical memory attached to this. And Republicans know that when they hear criticism, which is why the defense is usually framed in strictly procedural or partisan language. We're just drawing fair maps. We're following the law. This is about politics, not race. Because openly arguing against minority representation is politically toxic in modern America. So the language has to change. The mechanics evolve, but the outcome, critics fear, remains extremely similar. Reducing the electoral influence of black voters in order to strengthen Republican control. And one thing that keeps getting lost in this discussion is that district maps are not neutral little geometry projects. They determine who gets heard. Think about the practical impact of that for a second. A district map can influence whether abortion restrictions pass, whether labor protections survive, whether Medicaid expands, whether environmental regulations exist, whether voting protections strengthen or weaken. Maps are policy before policy even happens. They are the invisible architecture underneath every piece of legislation, which is why politicians fight over them like dragons sitting on piles of electoral gold. And honestly, one of the most frustrating parts of this whole national conversation is how often gerrymandering gets treated like just a clever strategy instead of what it actually is: a structural manipulation of representation. People talk about it like a football coach drawing up a smart play. No. This is closer to redesigning the dimensions of the field. And when you combine that with rapidly changing demographics, shrinking Republican performance in suburban areas, and increasing dependence on structural advantages to maintain power, I mean, you start understanding why these map fights have become absolutely feral. Because for many Republican strategists, this is not just about one election cycle. No way. This is about preserving long-term governing power in a country where demographic trends are not necessarily moving in their favor. And again, Democrats absolutely pursue advantage too. But Democrats, at least nationally, have increasingly supported independent commissions and anti-gerrymandering reforms. Republicans oppose those efforts because the current system benefits them more in key states. That's just reality. And if you strip away all the talking points, the core logic underneath the Alabama situation starts looking pretty straightforward. A favorable Supreme Court climate created an opportunity. Republicans recognize the opportunity. Now they're exploring how aggressively they can use it. And the reason people should care is because democratic systems do not collapse in one dramatic explosion. I don't know how many times I've said that on this podcast. They erode through normalization. One exception becomes two. Two becomes a precedent, and a precedent then becomes a routine. And eventually people stop reacting altogether. That's how institutional trust dies. Not with fireworks, with exhaustion. Now, whenever this conversation comes up, Republicans almost always fall back on one particular defense. If Democrats hate gerrymandering so much, why do Democrat states do it too? And again, the criticism is not entirely wrong. Democrats have absolutely drawn favorable maps where they had the power to do it. Illinois has been accused of it. Maryland has been accused of it. New York Democrats tried pushing aggressive maps. And we've seen things recently in California and Virginia. Nobody in American politics is walking around with perfectly clean hands here. But here's where the conversation changes. Because while both parties may use the system, only one party has consistently fought to preserve the system itself at the national level. And I think that distinction matters. Congressional Democrats have repeatedly backed federal reforms aimed at reducing partisan gerrymandering. Independent redistricting commissions, stronger voting protections, expanded transparency requirements, updated Voting Rights Act protections. Republicans overwhelmingly oppose those efforts. And I know if there's any conservatives listening right now, some of you are probably already saying, well, of course they opposed them. Democrats thought the reforms would help Democrats. Probably true. Politics is not a Disney movie. Nobody suddenly sprouts angel wings because they introduced election reform legislation. But motive does not erase outcome. If one party is at least attempting to build national guardrails against gerrymandering, while the other party consistently blocks those guardrails because the current system benefits them, that should tell you something important about where each side believes its political advantage lies. And for Republicans, especially after 2010, that advantage increasingly lived in map making. That was a turning point people really underestimate. After the 2010 census, Republicans dominated state legislatures across huge portions of the country, and they used that power aggressively during redistricting. North Carolina, Wisconsin, Texas, Ohio. State after state produced maps so engineered that Democrats could win millions more votes overall and still struggle to gain proportional representation. That is just wild to me. Imagine two teams playing basketball where one team scores more points overall, but somehow still loses because the court itself was redesigned district by district. And maybe that's a far-fetched metaphor, but you see what I'm talking about. At a certain point, people stop debating strategy and start asking whether the system itself it still reflects the actual intent of the voters. And this is where conservatives often pivot towards a very old school argument. Redistricting is political by nature. Legislatures are supposed to control it. Which, technically, yes. Politics has always influenced districting. But modern data technology changed the scale of that completely. This is not 19th century politicians eyeballing county lines anymore. Modern gerrymandering is a frighteningly precise effort. Analysts can model turnout behavior down to microscopic levels. They can test hypothetical districts like engineers stress testing bridge designs. How many Democrats can we pack here? How thin can we spread black voters there? What happens if we shift this suburb to another district? What if turnout drops 3% among younger voters? It's political micro-targeting fused directly into the structure of representation itself. And once that capability exists, the temptation to abuse it is enormous. Especially in an era where many politicians are less interested in persuading swing voters and more interested in permanently securing structural advantage. Persuasion is hard. Changing minds is hard. Designing safer districts, much easier. And one of the reasons this frustrates progressives so deeply is because conservatives spent decades branding themselves as defenders of constitutional principles, democratic integrity, and original American values. But increasingly, many Republican leaders seem perfectly comfortable manipulating democratic structures themselves so long as the manipulation helps to maintain power. How do you ignore that? You cannot spend years warning Americans that democracy is hanging by a thread while simultaneously supporting systems that reduce electoral accountability. You can't scream about the will of the people while designing districts specifically meant to neutralize portions of those people. And honestly, some Republicans aren't even subtle about this anymore. You hear arguments like, well, cities shouldn't dominate rural voters. Or, we need maps that preserve conservative representation. I mean, that sounds nicer than just coming out and saying, we're trying to maintain power despite demographic trends. But that's often what is underneath it. And here's the really dangerous part. Once one side becomes heavily dependent on structural advantages to maintain their power, it becomes harder and harder to walk away from those advantages voluntarily. Because losing fair competition starts feeling existential. So every election becomes an emergency. Every demographic shift becomes a threat. Every court ruling becomes warfare. And that creates a political culture where manipulating systems starts feeling justified because the alternative is viewed as unacceptable defeat. That mindset is poison for actual democracy. Not because one side wants to win. Everybody wants to win. But because healthy democracies require political parties to believe they can survive losing sometimes. The second losing becomes intolerable, the incentives to win start getting very, very ugly. And I know this is the point where some people tune out because they think, yeah, okay, I don't live in Alabama. Fair enough. But this is not really about Alabama. Alabama is just the current pressure point that's making the news. The bigger issue is what happens to the democracy as a whole when representation itself becomes increasingly engineered. Because district maps are not abstract political trivia. They directly shape the laws governing your life. Who gets health care? Who loses it? Whether unions survive. Where public schools get funded. Environmental protections. Whatever. Anything you can think of. All of that begins upstream with representation. And gerrymandering quickly distorts that representation before a single vote is even cast. This matters nationally. Because when districts become heavily manipulated, politicians become less accountable to the public. If a district is designed to heavily favor one party, the representative's biggest threat is not losing to the other party in a general election. That threat, the threat becomes losing a primary to somebody even more ideologically extreme than they are. It's virtually the end of moderation because moderation ceases to be rewarded. Compromise not only isn't rewarded, it becomes dangerous. And suddenly politicians are incentivized to perform outrage instead of governance because outrage motivates primary voters. That's one reason American politics keeps feeling more unstable and more unhinged. We built incentives that reward theatrical extremism. And I think ordinary people sense this even if they don't really know the mechanics behind it. People look at Congress and they think, why does everybody seem insane right now? Why is there no compromise? Well, because in many districts, politicians barely need to appeal at all to broad coalitions anymore. They just need to survive highly partisan primaries inside carefully engineered districts. That changes political behavior, and it changes it dramatically. And one thing I really want everyone to understand is that gerrymandering doesn't just distort outcomes. It distorts psychology. If voters start believing elections are structurally rigged before they even happen, civic trust begins collapsing. Not just trust in parties, but trust in the whole system. trust in democracy itself. And America is already running dangerously low on institutional trust. People don't trust Congress. They don't trust the media. They don't trust the courts. They don't trust elections. And let's face it, they don't trust each other. Now, at a growing perception that politicians can just manipulate district maps whenever demographic trends threaten their victories. Fantastic. What could possibly go wrong there? And look, some conservatives listening may say, well, Democrats would absolutely do the same thing if they could. In some cases, yes, they would. But here's why I keep coming back to Republicans in this conversation, because the modern conservative movement has increasingly wrapped itself in the language of defending democracy and defending constitutional order and defending election integrity and defending the founders and defending America and on and on. Okay, then those standards should apply here too. You don't get to treat democracy like a sacred object one minute and customizable the next. And honestly, one of the darkest ironies in all of this is that many of the same politicians warning Americans about election interference are perfectly comfortable structurally engineering representation itself through these redesigned maps. No fake ballots required. All the talk about fake ballots and bogus ballots and double ballots and dead people voting, none of it matters. Hacked voting machines don't matter. No conspiracy theories required. Just redraw the districts. That's what makes this issue so important and so under-discussed at the same time. Because gerrymandering is boring television. It's maps and stats and court filings and procedural fights. Nobody's setting a car on fire outside a courthouse. But structurally, it may be one of the most powerful tools for shaping political outcomes in the entire country. And that's why the Supreme Court shift matters so much. Because once courts become more reluctant to intervene, once federal protections weaken, once states gain broader freedom to pursue partisan goals under the language of quote-unquote race neutrality, the incentives become obvious. Push harder, go farther, see what survives judicial review. That's the environment that we're entering into right now. And if you think politicians will voluntarily restrain themselves in that environment out of just, pure civic virtue, I have a bridge to sell you. Power protects itself. Always. That's why democracies need rules strong enough to constrain the people holding power. Even when those people believe they're justified. Maybe even especially then. Because every political movement believes its victory is morally necessary. The test of democratic commitment is whether you still support fair systems when fair systems might allow you to lose. That's the hard part. That's the real part. And right now, I think America is entering a period where an awful lot of politicians seem increasingly uncomfortable with the possibility of losing fairly or honestly. And maybe that's the thing underneath this entire story that just bothers me. It's not just Alabama, and it's not just district maps, not even the imbalanced Supreme Court. It's the growing sense that too many people in power are treating democracy less like a system of representation and more like a problem that needs to be managed. Like voters are variables and elections are obstacles. Like public opinion is something that they have to work around instead of responding to. And once that mindset takes hold, everything starts becoming negotiable. District lines are negotiable. Voting access becomes negotiable. Election schedules become negotiable. Representation itself becomes negotiable. And eventually, the public starts asking a very dangerous question. if politicians can keep changing the structure whenever power is threatened, how much of any of this is real? That question is poison to democracy, because democratic systems do not survive on laws alone. They require legitimacy. People have to believe the rules are stable. They have to believe elections mean something. They have to believe that their vote exists inside of a system that is at least trying to reflect public will honestly. Not perfectly, not magically, certainly not without politics, but at least honestly. What worries me about this current moment is not that politicians are political. That's normal. That's what it is. Politicians chasing advantage is as old as civilization itself. Somewhere in ancient Rome, there was probably a senator drawing weird little district lines in olive oil while insisting that it was about preserving tradition. Whatever. The problem now is scale. Technology made modern gerrymandering vastly more powerful. Polarization makes it more tempting. And a changing legal environment has made it easier to defend. That combination is nothing short of combustible, especially in a country already drowning in distrust. And again, let's be crystal clear about something. The Supreme Court did not erase race from districting. Race still shapes voting behavior. Race still shapes representation. Race still shapes political outcomes to a degree. What changed is that states now have more room to ignore racial impact while framing aggressive map making as partisan strategy instead of what it is, at least in many instances, racial discrimination. That distinction matters enormously, because if race and party heavily overlap, you can weaken minority political influence while claiming the entire exercise was merely politically motivated rather than racially motivated. That's the new battlefield. And honestly, I think a lot of Americans can feel the shift, even if they don't, understand all the legal terminology. They can feel institutions bending, and they can feel guardrails weakening, and they can feel this constant escalation. And I think most people are exhausted by the sense that every election now comes with procedural warfare attached to it. Exhausted by the idea that no rule stays settled for long, by watching politicians treat democratic norms like, optional software updates that you can just opt out of. Because here's the thing, healthy democracies are supposed to make losing elections survivable. That's sort of the point. You lose an election, you regroup, you argue your case, you try again the next cycle. But when political movements start believing that losing is unacceptable at any cost, the temptation to manipulate structures, it just becomes overwhelming. And that is where democracies start drifting into very dangerous territory. Again, not all at once, not with dramatic music or tanks in the streets, just quietly. Through normalization and procedural gamemanship, through endless little exceptions that just accumulate over time until those of us in the public barely remember what stable democratic norms used to feel like. That's why this Alabama story matters, because it's not just about Alabama. It's about a broader national question. Do voters still choose politicians, or are politicians increasingly choosing their voters? Those are not the same thing, not remotely. And if America keeps moving towards a system where maps are engineered with surgical precision to predetermine outcomes before voting ever begins, then eventually elections aren't fully competitive. They're not fully competitive expressions of the public that these people end up representing. They're just managed environments. And once people stop believing the system honestly reflects them, how do you rebuild that trust? At the very least, it's extremely difficult, if it's possible at all. So no, this is not just a boring fight over maps. This is a fight over representation and accountability and democratic legitimacy itself. And personally, I don't think politicians should get to redraw the battlefield every time they don't like where the battle is heading. Either side. Because once voters start feeling like the system itself is adjustable depending on who holds power, you don't just weaken one election. You weaken everything. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I would love to hear what you guys think about this. I'm curious because I don't know how well this translates to average Jane and Joe voter who don't spend unhealthy amounts of time looking at this stuff like I do. If you want to, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and go to the contacts page and either DM me on social media or use the email address to send me an email and let me know what you think about all this. I would love to hear from you about this and anything else for that matter. While you're on the website, you can also check out the episodes section where you can stream or download any episode of the podcast, that going all the way back to the first episode. And there's the blog section, of course, and I mention this every episode. I put posts on the blog that mirror the things I talk about in each episode of the podcast, and I include all of my sources that I use for my information. In today's day and age, I don't think there's much more important than being able to say where you got your information from. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.